All right. So today's class is going to be about cultural relativism. It's going to be the final of our classes in which we talk about ethical topics that you might want to write a paper on. So the way class is going to go today is I'm going to talk about what cultural relativism is, what some of the arguments that people give for cultural relativism are, what the reasons are that people tend to be cultural relativist. Then we're going to go through some of the responses against it. Then we'll talk together about anyone's views, anything you want to bring up. And then at the end of class, I will just run through the game plan for what the final 3 weeks of the class are going to look like. So we all good at this point? So let's start off. What is cultural relativism? So how many people have heard this phrase, cultural relativism? Has anyone heard of it before? If not, no worries. Absolutely no worries. But all right, so let's break it down then. What is culture, or what is it for something to be cultural? What is the culture? And this is, again, like nothing, this is not a tricky philosophy question, just straight up. When somebody says their culture or my culture is so-and-so, what do they mean by that?
Like customs and ideas.
Yeah, it's customs and ideas very often tied into what your ethnicity is or where you're from. It's like location-based or history-based or something like that. So by culture, we literally just mean like things tied around, you know, American culture is a certain way and it's like defined in a certain way, or New York culture or that sort of thing. So that's all we mean by culture. Now, what is relativism? Well, the key difference, the two terms to keep apart are relative and objective. So how many people have heard the phrase objective, or something is an objective fact? What does that mean? Anyone? No? If not, no worries.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Something that is not biased?
Yeah, it's not biased, and specifically, it's the truth that's the same for everyone. Something that's relative, by contrast, is something that's only true or false given some other parameter. So let's take an example. These two markers, there's a green one and a black one. Which one is bigger?
The green one looks like it's bigger.
How about now? Which one is bigger?
The green one.
How about now?
Oh, the green
How
one.
about now? Doesn't matter. Now, however, which one is to the right? Describe from your perspective which one is to the right.
The white.
Green one.
From your perspective.
The white one.
Yeah, this one, this black or white one. From my perspective, however, it looks like this. Which one's to the right?
The green one.
The green one.
So right and left are relative terms. Whether something is to the right or left is relative to your position. Size, however, is not relative to position. No matter where they are, one is bigger than the other, no matter which side. So an objective fact, it's an objective fact that the green one is bigger than the white or black or whatever color we're going to call this one. It is a relative fact that this one is to the right of that one, or to the left, depending on how you're oriented. So that's what we mean by relative versus objective. So what are some other things that are relative? The law. What is the law relative to?
It's probably relative to the state or the city or wherever.
Yeah, location. It's relative to location. So there are things in New York which are illegal, which are legal somewhere else. For instance, carrying a firearm. If you walk down New York City, a New York City street with a concealed firearm, that is illegal. If you do that in Texas, that is perfectly legal. Well, certain places in Texas. So that is what we mean by relative versus objective. Now, let's combine these two things together. If something is culturally or culturally relative, what is this thing going to be relative to?
To the culture.
Yeah, your culture. So in this context, we're talking about the idea that morality is relative to culture. So what does it mean to say morality is relative to a culture? Well, it means that, well, what is what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad is not the same for everyone the world over. Rather, what's right or wrong is only relative to the culture you're living in. So let's go with a concrete example. So let's draw red person, green person,
Yeah.
So what is green person doing to red person? They're stabbing them in the heart and killing them. They are committing a human sacrifice. Green person is sacrificing red person to the gods or to something like this. Now, what is a cultural relativist going to say about this case? Is what green is doing wrong? Green is stabbing red in the, looks like the throat and killing them. According to a cultural relativist, is this right? Is this wrong? What do we say about this case?
It's wrong.
We can.
It like depends on the
On the
perspective.
situation.
It's going to depend. And what does it depend on? Well, it depends on what culture this person lives in. We don't know enough about the case yet. Let's imagine that this is happening right now in New York City. Is this person is this person doing something morally wrong? Is green doing something morally wrong if they are committing a human sacrifice in Times Square?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
Because the culture here, it's grown for us here. It's grown.
Exactly. In our culture, it is wrong to commit human sacrifice. New York City, no worries, Joseph. In New York City, it is morally wrong to commit human sacrifice. However, if we were in a different time, in a different place, in which human sacrifice was an accepted part of the culture, then what green would be doing would not be morally wrong. What green is doing then might actually be morally right, because in that culture, it's expected that once a year you commit human sacrifice for the sake of the gods or something along those lines. So a moral relativist, a cultural relativist is going to say what's right or wrong is not going to be like the act of killing someone in a human sacrifice. It depends on where you are, what culture you're in, what time period you're in. Now, the group that would say there is a fact of the matter are moral objectivists. An objectivist is going to say, if human sacrifice is wrong today, then it was wrong 1,000 years ago. It was wrong 10,000 years ago. It is wrong in the United States. It is wrong in Africa. It is wrong in Australia. It's wrong at the North Pole. It's wrong in a space station. It is always wrong to commit human sacrifice. By contrast, you might have an objectivist who says human sacrifice is okay, and it's always okay. But the objectivist says it's always the same for anyone, no matter what society they're in. A relativist is going to say that's not the case. It changes from place to place, culture to culture. In Aztec society in Mexico 1,000 years ago, human sacrifice was a common practice in their religion. In that society, it was not morally wrong. Today, if you were to carry out the same thing in New York City, it would be morally wrong. That's what a cultural relativist says. So does everyone understand the difference? For an objectivist, morality is the same for everybody. For a relativist, it's not. It changes depending on culture. So if that's what relativism is, what reason do we have, or what reasons might you have to think that relativism is correct? What is the motivation, or what are the, sorts of evidence that you could give that relativism is correct? And there's no one right answer, but there's a lot of different right answers to this. So if anyone wants to take a stab or say why they think that cultural relativism is a reasonable view, feel free. All right, so one of the main reasons why people are drawn to cultural relativism is this idea of where our moral views come from? So, where do most of us learn what's right and wrong? Who teaches it to us, or what teaches it to us?
Family,
Our parents.
society.
Yeah, our family, our caregivers, our friends, the people who are around us. And so where did they learn it from? Well, it seems like they learned it from other people who taught them. And in a lot of ways, the way we learn our moral views seem a lot like other parts of our culture. Like, how do you know what type of pants are cool to wear or what sorts of shirts aren't okay? Well, somebody taught you. Or how do you know that you have to wear pants out in the world? Well, your parents taught you. How do you know that you aren't supposed to wear hats into a church? Well, your parents taught you. So it looks like if you look at where we get our moral views from, it seems in a lot of cases, it's a similar sort of thing to where our other sorts of cultural features come from. So in the same way that morality gets taught, it looks like other cultural things are taught in the same way, which suggests that perhaps morality, like these other cultural features, are normative, or like what type of food to cook, or what type of foods are normal to eat for dinner. That's something we learn from caregivers and other members of our culture. So that seems like a similarity between etiquette, cultural differences, and morality. We're taught by our caregivers. Another reason cultural relative. Oh, Jessica, did you have a question?
Oh. No, Professor, no.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. I didn't want to cut you off. All right. Number two, another reason to think that it's correct is what's our main reason when we see something is wrong in our everyday life? How do we know it's wrong? What is the train of thought like? Describe, if you see somebody punch someone on the street, how do you know it's wrong?
Our parents taught you?
Yeah, you just, you see it, you have a response to it, you kind of feel disgusted, you get upset. So the main way you know that something is morally incorrect, or the main way you think you know something is morally incorrect, is this sort of like gut feeling sort of thing. And as a matter of fact, different people around the world have different views on what they just gut reaction think is morally right and morally wrong. So, views worldwide. So for instance, the reading had this example of the Colossians and the Greeks. So these were ancient people in the Persian Empire back in like the year 500 BCE. And the reading talks about the Greek burial practice, or when somebody died, what did the Greeks do? Well, they did cremation. The body was burned so the spirit could be released. For the Colossians, however, the relatives after the person died, they would eat the dead person. They would eat parts of them. And this was a way of revering them, because when you ate this person, you were making this person who you loved and respected a part of you forever. So these were two very different views. And if you ask the Colossians, what is it to burn? Like, think about burning somebody after they die. They'd be like, oh my God, that's horrible. That is morally repulsive. That is terrible. You ask the Greeks, eat somebody, and they're gonna be like, oh my God, that is horrible. That is reprehensible. That is disrespectful. So it looks like the views are different worldwide, and people, the main way we go about knowing that something's wrong are these gut feelings that change from place to place. So this is the way in which it looks like, if you look around the world, the way we know something is right or wrong is this gut feeling that is different for different people in different places. So that's this sort of moral argument. A third one is relativism slides into ethnocentrism / colonialism. So another issue with moral objectivism is it's a matter of fact that most people who are moral objectivists do not think that there's only one right answer and somebody else has it. They're usually like, there's only one answer and I'm the one who's right. What I think is right or wrong, I'm the correct one. And so very often, if you have this objective view about like our way is right, there's this tendency to say that your culture is better and to disrespect people of other cultures. So one of the other reasons that cultural relativism is appealing is that a cultural relativist is able to ensure that you are not imposing your views on somebody else. If you say somebody else's views are just different from yours, not better or worse, and you accept that you're not in a position to judge them, then you aren't going to treat people in different places with different views as lesser in any way. So there's also this sort of, if you're a relativist, it's pretty straightforward and simple of not being a colonialist who thinks like the Western Christian virtues that are practiced here are just definitely better than everywhere else, and Western European culture is better and blah, blah, blah. Because very often objectivists were people of empire in the 19th and early 20th century who said like, our way is the best way and we need to bring culture to the lesser, more primitive peoples. And so in response to that, we now look back on that and say, that's kind of not something we want to do. So in this, excuse me, in this context, going relativist avoids that pitfall. You can be, if you're a relativist, you're guaranteed to be respecting other people. If you're an objectivist, you can tend to slide into this sort of colonial ethnocentrism. To be clear, this is not a guarantee. You can be objectivist, like it is perfectly reasonable to say, there is one right thing of what's to do, and it's certainly not what I'm doing. So you could do that. You could be like, I'm a terrible person. There is an objective fact and I'm breaking it. Or this other culture does it better than me. But as a matter of fact, most people think the way they do it is right and therefore have a tendency to impose their views on others. All right. So everyone on board thus far with these different views. All right, let me take a sip of water and then we will get into the responses. Anyone have anything they want to bring up at this point? All right, so that's the arguments for cultural relativism. And depending on my mood, I find them incredibly persuasive or incredibly unpersuasive. There's no view in philosophy which I swing back and forth on more often than the relativism-objectivism debate. So what I want to talk about now is the arguments which objectivists now raise in response to relativism. So we've got this view on the table that there's no moral facts, rather what's right or wrong changes based on your culture. And relative to a certain culture, there is a fact of the matter, like in the United States, it is wrong to kill people, even in human sacrifice, but you can't say for all humanity ever. An objectivist is now going to say, no, no, no. The motivation that relativists give is not good, and actually it's better to be an objectivist. So that's what we're going to be talking about now. What are the reasons that objectivists give for thinking that moral relativism is not the correct view to have? So the first thing that moral objectivists bring up is the disagreement argument isn't sound. The difference/disagreement argument. So this is the argument which a lot of relativists give. The idea is premise one: people around the world disagree about what's right. Premise two: if people disagree, then there's no objective fact. Conclusion: there's no objective fact as to what's right or wrong. So going back to what we talked about earlier in the semester, this is just a very straightforward argument. And not only is it a straightforward argument, it is a valid argument. If it's true that people around the world disagree about what's right, and it's true that if people disagree, then there's no objective fact of the matter, then it is true that there's no objective fact of the matter. So this is a valid argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. However, according to objectivists, it is not a sound argument. And remember from way back when, for an argument to be sound is for it to be valid and to have true premises. So a moral objectivist is going to say, yes, it is true. This is true. Premise one is true. People around the world do disagree about what's right. However, they're going to deny premise two. They're going to say that the fact that people disagree about what's right does not necessarily show that there's no objective fact. Now, this argument is not designed to show that cultural relativism is wrong. It's just designed to show that we don't know cultural relativism is right. So to show a premise is wrong, you just have to find a counterexample to it. You have to show, if it were the case that if people disagree, then there'd be no objective fact of the matter, then you'd have to find cases in which, if you want to show this is wrong, you find cases in which people disagree, even though there is an objective fact of the matter. So anyone have an example of something? So the way this response on the part of the objectivists is going is they're saying, look, you're claiming that the fact that people disagree about morality is proof that there's no objective fact of the matter. But I'm now going to explain to you that there are times in which people disagree. And even though they disagree, there's still a fact of the matter. One of the groups is, as a matter of fact, wrong, even if they're disagreeing. So anyone have an example that they can think of this? A case in which people disagree, but in truth, one of the groups really is right.
Professor, can be arranged marriage be one?
So arranged marriage is one where I think it's going to depend on
your
one which is a
culture,
little bit questionable. I think an objectivist is going to say, like an objectivist about morality who disagrees with arranged marriage is going to say, this is clearly a case in which people are disagreeing, but there is an objective fact of the matter. But because we don't want to use an ethical example to prove the point, a clearer case would be one from a non-ethical case. So I think that's a good example if you want to say that arranged marriage is wrong, but I don't want to commit us in an ethical example yet.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anyone have an example for maybe an area outside of ethical questions? There's one that always pops into my head. So here. Versus. So one thing people disagree about is Earth flat or round? This is something which people do disagree about. If you want to go to the Flat Earth Society and join in a discussion about why we know the Earth is flat, you are welcome to do so because such a society exists. Also, there are many people who believe the Earth is round. These two people truly disagree, but does that mean there's no fact of the matter as to whether the Earth is round or flat? Does this mean that for flat earthers, the Earth is flat, and for round earthers, the Earth is round? They believe it, but does that make it the case? Does that make it a fact that for round earthers only, the Earth is round?
No.
No, it doesn't. No matter what your views are, you can have cases with mistaken belief and have people disagree where one of the groups is wrong. So the way this argument goes for the objectivists is you say, look, people disagree about morality, but the fact that people disagree about morality doesn't mean there's no objective moral fact of the matter, because people disagree about all sorts of stuff. People disagree about the shape of the Earth, but we all know there is a fact of the matter. Like, even if you 100%, like, you either believe the Earth is flat and you're either right or wrong, or more accurately, you're wrong, or you believe the Earth is round, in which case you're either right or wrong. In fact, you're right. But nobody thinks that for some people the Earth is round and for some people the Earth is flat. There's an objective fact of the matter and people are still able to disagree about it. So the idea of this argument is premise 2 is no good, therefore the argument doesn't go through. The idea that just because there are cultural differences in the world does not show that relativism has to be true, because it's perfectly possible that large numbers of people are wrong about morality. Now, this argument does not prove that cultural relativism is wrong. It's just designed to show that an argument for cultural relativism isn't right. So that's the first argument that objectivists give. They try to say, look, relativists, you think you've got this great argument here, and we just showed that your argument isn't nearly as good as you think it is. Now what the objectivist does is they raise a few other issues with relativism. And these are direct attacks on relativism. The idea is supposed to be, these are things that a relativist cannot account for. So, there go all my markers. So that was one. Number 2, an issue with relativism is if cultural relativism is true, no critiquing other cultures, other critiquing actions from the outside. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you look around at the way that human beings have behaved across human history, it very often seems like we want to criticize other cultures, even if we aren't a part of that culture. So to take a classic example, crucifixion. We know what it is. It's an incredibly painful and miserable way to die. As a matter of fact, if you're tied up on the cross, you die of dehydration and suffocation just because your lungs collapse in on yourself. It's excruciatingly painful. And you can survive up there in pain as your muscles collapse for hours and hours and hours. When we look back on Roman society as an example in which crucifixion was common, what do we generally want to say about a society in which crucifixion was common? Or what is your gut feeling about it? Well, very often it seems like what people want to say is, well, a society that did that was wrong. It's not just that they were different from us. It's that crucifixion is wrong. It is a bad thing. It is something that needs to, most people don't just say, well, that was the way the Romans had fun. We have fun in a different way. We're just different. Rather, it seems like we want to say that the Romans were wrong. However, if you're a relativist, you don't get to say that. Why not? Well, because for the relativist, the only thing that makes something right or wrong is what happened in that society or what was accepted in that society. So because the Romans thought crucifixion was a great time and very fun for everybody else, therefore, and this is actually a matter of fact, so gladiatorial games in ancient Rome, they were broken into 3 parts of the day. You had the morning in which you'd have people fight animals, the afternoon in which people would fight each other. But then during the lunch break, they'd have the public executions because, nothing helps your food go down better than watching some poor person get tortured to death. So yeah, they literally take the criminals out into the middle of the Colosseum during the lunch break. So you had some entertainment as you ate and you just watch people get eaten alive or yeah. So, cultural differences. We today, though, very often want to say, no, that is just wrong. That is objectively wrong. But if you're a relativist, you don't get to say that. Another thing you don't get to say is cultural relativists don't get moral progress. So what do I mean by this? Well, it looks like very often we want to say that the way we do things now is better than the way we did them before. So in the year 1850 in the United States of America, especially in the South, what was a very common practice, which we no longer have in the United States today? At least not out in the open.
Lynching, maybe?
So lynching would be one, but even before that, what was it that, before all the Jim Crow era, yes, Scarlett says slavery, yes, that's the one I'm thinking of. Most people want to say we have improved as a society. We have made moral progress. We no longer have slavery. I mean, there is still human trafficking and sex slavery. So like, let's not say that there's no slavery at all today in the world. But at the very least, we as a society do not have that out in the open. It's not an acceptable part of our society to just, you know, have people of color as your slaves. You cannot own these people. And we want to say that that is moral progress. We have in some sense improved as a society. However, a moral relativist, a cultural relativist doesn't get to say that. Why not? What does a cultural relativist have to say about slavery?
They were just acting based on the time that they existed in.
Yeah, they just did things differently then. We don't get to judge them because we didn't live back then. We have not made progress. We used to do, our ancestors did things one way, we do things a different way, and that's just the fact of the matter. In the same way that, you know, we used to wear top hats all the time, or we used to wear big skirts, and now people don't often wear big skirts because now we're all in lockdown and all we wear is pajamas. These are the sorts of things in which like things were once done one way, now they're done another way. And you know, we used to enslave people, now we don't anymore. So a relativist doesn't get to say that there's been moral progress in a way that a moral objectivist does. The objectivist is able to say, the way we used to do things, there's a scale of what's morally right for everybody. And up there in the sky or up in wherever the morality lives, we have improved according to that objective scale. And so because of that, we are better. The relativist doesn't get to say that. Now let's talk about the other two, the final two arguments, and then we can talk about things that a relativist might say in response. But does everyone understand these two arguments? It's kind of like it's a bite the bullet style argument. So what does it mean to bite the bullet? Well, it means that you have to accept something that you really probably don't want to have to accept in an argument. So in this case, if you're going to be a cultural relativist, then you have to bite the bullet and accept that critiquing actions from the outside is not a good fit or isn't allowed. And you just have to be like, you're right. I cannot judge other societies in which genocide was conducted because they were just different from me. I don't get to say we're better than we used to be. All I can say is we're different. All right. So everyone on board with this so far? All right. Number 4 and number 5. Different circumstances, not values. All right. So this response by the objectivist is to point to a lot of the sorts of examples that moral relativists or cultural relativists point to and say, if you actually look at them more closely, these aren't signs that people have different moral views. All it's showing is that these people are in different circumstances from things you find yourself in. So the example from the book or from the reading is the example of Eskimo culture. Eskimo culture, I don't actually know if Eskimo is politically correct anymore. I don't think it is, but the book uses it. So if I offend anyone, I'm really sorry. I'll move back and forth between Eskimo and Inuit because I think those are the same groups of people and one of them is less offensive. If Eskimo is offensive, I'm not sure where we stand right now. But this group of people live in northern Greenland and northern Canada. These are the people who live in igloos, live in small groups, survive on hunting walruses, and surviving in incredibly harsh, cold winters. Now, if you go and look at these cultural practices, you find some things that strike outsiders as incredibly extreme. So for instance, infanticide is incredibly common in this culture and not frowned upon. What is infanticide?
Eating children?
Yeah, killing newborn or young children. That is what infanticide is. So if you go into Eskimo society or Inuit society, it's very common for these people to kill young children, especially young girls. Another thing is if you get to a certain age, it is expected that you will just one day under your own volition wander out into the wilderness to freeze to death. So grandma gets to a certain age and everyone kind of says, all right, grandma, it's your time to go. And grandma takes off her coat and trudges out into the wilderness to freeze to death. So you might look at this society and you say, oh, wow, this is a society that does things fundamentally different from us. Their values are different. They value human life less than we do. They're willing to kill children. They're willing to demand that grandma sacrifice herself to the cold. However, is this the right conclusion to draw? Is it really a sign that Eskimo people care less about human life? What's another explanation you might give? So for this explanation, Jeff.
No, that it's their necessity. They do it because they're trying to survive.
Yeah, here's the fact about the North. They're up near the North Pole. It is cold. There is not much food, and survival is very precarious. It's not the sort of thing where in American society today, if you're planning on having 2 kids and you have an accident, then that 3rd kid is probably going to find it a little more difficult, but that child is going to still be able to generally be fed. It is going to be assisted. It is not going to die. And more importantly, the rest of the society is not going to die. But in a culture in which you don't have a lot of food, if you suddenly have more mouths than you can feed, you are not just having one child die, you are having an entire society dying. So in the same way with grandma, if you keep grandma in the house, you're still gonna, I mean, she's gonna be annoying because, you know, you get to a certain age, everyone's annoying. I know I'm gonna be guilty of it, but you know, she's not gonna like put your entire house at risk. She's not gonna put your entire family at risk by existing. However, in this society in which if grandma gets too old and she cannot do anything beneficial, then the fact is that she is not going to do anything except be a drain on resources and put the entire society at risk. So and even the gender difference of infanticide makes sense. So in Eskimo society, the men are mainly the hunters and they go out in these little kayaks and they go out hunting things like walruses. Walruses are really big, and if you piss off a walrus, it will ruin your day. Also, if you fall overboard in like 20-degree water, you are going to freeze to death. So men die very often out hunting. So therefore, if you just let society, if you raised boys and girls in the same amount, you would have a major gender disparity, because a lot of the adult men would die hunting and a lot of the adult women would not, and therefore you would have more women than men and the society would fall apart. So it's not even just that the infanticide makes sense in these extreme circumstances, it's an infanticide that leans towards women. In these extreme circumstances, it makes a bit more sense. So the idea is that, say what you will about Eskimo society, and you still might think like it is somehow this is wrong, you should just not kill children. At the very least, though, you can make the argument that if you actually look at this society, in our society, the choice is between, if you're looking at the choice of infanticide, your options are either kill a newborn child and have 4 other people live, or save a newborn child and have 4 other people live. So it's either 5 or 4. But in an Eskimo society, your choices are either kill this child and the other 4 people live, or everybody dies because there's not enough food to go around. And so the idea is, if you look at a lot of these cultural practices, maybe it's not a difference in morality. Maybe the values are the same. It's just that the circumstances are so extreme that in extreme circumstances, you have to do things which wouldn't usually be morally right. Another example, are people familiar with what happened with the Chilean national rugby team in the 80s? Are people familiar with this story? It's not as commonly talked about, Jeff.
I think that a plane went down and they were like stuck there for a few days or months, I think, and they had to, opt for eating the people.
Yeah.
So they had to eat each other to survive.
This rugby team was in a plane. The plane crashed in the side of a mountain in the Andes. Big, tall mountain range in South America. Basically, a few people died in the crash, but most of the people survived. However, they were on the side of a mountain, and because it was supposed to be a short flight, didn't have a lot of food. They knew that no rescue party was coming for them. The only way they were going to be able to get off this mountain is if somebody hiked down to civilization and told them, these people are up there, we need a rescue team. So the issue was, it was a long hike down the mountain, and no one was going to be able to survive it without food. So in these circumstances, some of the rugby players decided, you know what, we will eat some of the dead, because in this extreme circumstance, we don't want to have to eat somebody. But in cases of extremes, eating someone became the better or the right thing to do, because it ended up saving more people. And I think that, like, even those of us who think like, I would never eat another person, in the right circumstances, like, you might reconsider that. Like, if I were one of the people who died in that plane crash, I would want you to eat me, like, survive as a group. That is the right thing to do. So in extreme cases, it seems like what look like different values might just be different circumstances. So the objectivist is saying, hey, relativist, you point to all these different behaviors and you say it's a sign of different morality, but you're being too simplistic. Sometimes it's other sorts of factors. So that's how that argument goes. The last one is different non-moral beliefs. So the death penalty is something which we commonly think of as a moral issue. You're either for the death penalty and you think it's morally acceptable, or you're against the death penalty. And so if you look at a certain society, you might think you can learn about their moral beliefs about the death penalty by watching their behaviors. However, so imagine this situation. You've got two societies. In one of them, if somebody commits murder, they get hanged. So, you know, they commit murder, you hang them, the person who committed the murder is dead. You can imagine another society in which they don't hang someone. In fact, what they do is they put them on a little boat and they send them out to sea and they say, we will never see you again. Just you have to keep going straight on this boat. Now, if you look at the society from this view, what would you say? Which of the two societies thinks the death penalty is acceptable? If you look from this view, which of the two, the ones with the hangings or the ones with the little boat? Which one does and which one does not, or etc.?
You would think that the hanging believes in the death penalty.
Yeah, you'd think the hanging society believes in the death penalty and the other one does not. However, imagine that what was actually happening is that this other society does believe in the death penalty. The thing is, they think the earth is flat. And so they think that if you put someone on a little boat and send them out to sea, they're going to fall off the earth and die an excruciating death. So in truth, these people both believe in the death penalty. But the difference is actually what they think of the world being like. Now, to be clear, I've made this little society up. It's just a clear example to show that sometimes if you look at differences in behavior and you think like, hey, this is proof that these societies have different moral beliefs, sometimes you might have to go, wait. Is it really that they have different moral beliefs, or do they just have different other beliefs? And because of that, they end up acting in different ways. So this is another way in which the moral objectivist is saying, hey, cultural relativist, you point to these behavioral differences and you say they're everywhere and they're so common and they're a sign that we must be having different moral systems. However, if you look more closely, sometimes what you think are signs of different morality is really a sign that you just think of the world in a different way. Another one might be a case in which the society thinks certain animals are sacred. So you might think like, oh, that is an objective moral difference. But the difference might be something like, it's not an idea of like certain things are more morally valuable than others, like certain animals. It's rather that there's something about the nature of reincarnation that human beings are more likely to be reborn in certain animals instead of others. That would be another case. So it's got nothing to do with an animal that you care about. It's rather that you don't want to kill people. And so that would be another case and would be the non-moral beliefs determining behavior. So just to summarize this, the cultural relativist is pointing to all these cultural differences and saying, this is proof that there's no objective fact of the matter. The moral objectivist now comes along and says, no. The things you point to are not actually proof that relativism is right. Because if relativism is right, you have to accept these unacceptable consequences. And also, some of the proof you point to is not showing what you think it is. So, everyone on board so far with just the way this back and forth is going? We doing all right? All right. Now, I think this is not the end of the line, though, because I think there are things that relativists can say in each of these cases. So, for instance, I think that in response to if cultural relativism is true, you cannot critique things from the outside. That's going to be true. But I think a relativist can say there's still a way in which you could critique a society. Anyone have any ideas of what this might look like? Even if you're not a member of society, how might you still be able to critique them if you are a relativist?
Based on those circumstances, I would have done, or they should have done.
Yeah, so what you can do actually is you can criticize someone based on their own lights. So for instance, let's just, for a matter of argument, say that the United States in 1850 was a different culture than today. So in that society where slavery was practiced, you might say from the outside, we cannot criticize them. But one thing you might say is these people were contradicting themselves. These were people who believed that in their Declaration of Independence and in their Constitution that all people are created equal. But at this very same time, they were contradicting themselves and treating different people differently. So even if cultural relativism is right, a cultural relativist could say, by this same token, these people can be criticized by their own lights. Or these Southern slave owners, they were morally wrong because they also, at the same time that they were treating people differently, were saying people are all the same. So you would say that, no, you are actually, we might not be able to critique from the outside, but we can critique them on their own terms. Same thing with moral progress. One thing you could say is define things in terms of, maybe you want to say that slavery in the United States, like American society in 1850 and American society today are similar enough that they can count as the same culture. So maybe from when we say that we've seen moral progress, we're just recognizing that cultures are more general than we like to define, or than the objectivist is saying it has to be. Another thing I think a relativist can say in response to these circumstances and these non-moral beliefs is it does seem like there are certain sorts of cases in which you can explain what's going on in terms of circumstances, and you can explain what's going on in terms of non-moral beliefs. But it does seem like there are some cultural differences, true, like fundamental differences in view, which are harder to explain in terms of different circumstances. So for instance, if you've got a society that believes in torturing people, and it seems like in those sorts of cases, like their circumstances do not demand torture. And yet in their society, it seems like that is a fundamentally different view. And it seems like they were just as convinced that it was okay as we are here. And it seems like the only difference is one of these moral beliefs of, is it okay or not okay to torture? So I think that a cultural relativist, it's not these arguments against relativism are not the end of the line. And this is why my views on relativism go back and forth and change so often, because I think there are very good arguments on both sides. And also, another thing to say about relativism, and just a highlight thing, is in the background, though, something to keep in mind is that just because you're an objectivist does not necessarily mean that you have to think there's only one right answer. So just to be clear, one of them, as I said, that third argument for relativism, the idea that to be relativistic is to ensure that you aren't being colonial or to think being ethnocentric. It is possible to be an objectivist and not be ethnocentric. So this is another argument an objectivist might give, is to say, like, look, cultural relativists, you say that the only way to ensure that I'm respecting other cultures is to say that they do things, everyone's way is equally good. But what you can say is, no, there are right answers and there are wrong answers. However, there can be more than one right answer. And just because I do something that way doesn't necessarily mean that I do it the correct way. But one final thing, regardless of what you say about it, both views therefore are able to Whether you think cultural relativism is right or objectivism is right, at the end of the day, you can be open to different cultures and different views, and you don't have to think that if you're an objectivist, I have to impose my views on other people and think I'm the best. Any other thoughts on this? Does anyone have any other arguments or ideas that they want to bring up? If you have like ideas percolating, great, because this is going to be one of the paper topics if you want to write about cultural relativism. Any other questions on how this sort of discussion went or what relativism is or anything along these lines? We doing all right? All right. If there are no more questions or comments or concerns, I now just want to spend like a final 5 minutes talking about what the hell is the rest of the semester going to look like. So if we've got nothing more on cultural relativism, I'll wipe away the board and put up my imaginary little calendar. We good?
This is just like a separate but relative thought. Like,
yeah.
I feel like years from now, maybe 100 years from now, some of the things that we consider to be ethical or morally correct will be also considered relative to our time.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that's another motivation about relativism. I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a great point because I should have mentioned it. Another reason to think that relativism is right is there's this sense of if you're an objectivist or if you think you're correct, then there's this tendency to think that, I have all the right answers, I have everything correct, and that's why I know. But if you actually if you go 100 years into the future and look back, our practices are going to look as crazy to those people as like slavery looks to us now. And so you might think, this shows that I have no right to think that I'm better because my relation to the people of the future and the fact that there's nothing right or the fact is I fully believe I'm correct. And yet I'm going to probably look crazy. And in the future, people are going to look back on me and be like, that person got it totally wrong. Like to take an example, it's possible that in 150 years, everyone's a vegetarian because we think animals are, we can't eat meat. So in that case, it's a good way of thinking like, oh, another reason is a motivation for cultural relativism is an objectivist often seems to treat it as like I have all the right answers. And a relativist says, who are you to judge? Because odds are in 100 years, people are going to look back on you and think you were just as dumb as you're currently thinking the people with slavery were. And if that's the case, then what right do you have? Your morality is just one way of doing it. You're no better than anyone else. So that's another great motivation to bring up about cultural relativism. Any other points? All right, let me put up our little schedule. So today is the 17th of whatever month this is, November. 17 November. Next class is 24 November. Then there's 1 December, 8 December, and 15 December. So 17 November is done. Now, this day here, there's no class. Paper due. Final paper due. So December 8th is the last class. Oh, I'm glad you found them interesting. All right, so December 8th is our last class. And then a week after December 8th, you have a 3 to 5 page paper due. This 3 to 5 page paper is to be on one of the 3 prompts that I assigned. The first prompt is about a trolley problem style case. The second one is about online hate speech. And the third one is about cultural relativism or species relativism. So the prompts are up there. You're going to want to look them over. Now, what is going to go on in these classes? Well, next week, there's a reading, which is an article by James Pryor, who teaches at NYU, and it's just called Guidelines to Writing a Philosophy Paper. And what this is literally just a guy who does philosophy writing how to write a paper and how to approach it. And if there's one thing to read this semester that is the most important thing for your grade, if you were like, what's the one thing, I haven't read anything all semester. Is there anything I need to read to like much improve my grade? Read the prior paper. That is the most useful thing to read. Now, this means that next class, that's all you need to do is read this. And then we're going to talk about how to write a paper all class. That's all it's going to be. How do you approach a paper? How do you think about a paper? What is it that you're trying to do in an argumentative paper? Basically, what it's going to be is talking about how to talk about what we've done all semester with arguments and premises, and how do you go about putting that into paper form. Now, the next class, December 1st, is going to be thesis week. Now, you will have an assignment due on December 1st, which will mostly just be graded on, it won't be graded on I will take off some points if you're totally off base, but it's more going to be graded for completeness. And what this assignment is there are 3 prompts, and basically to practice thesis writing and talk about what theses are, and I'll talk about them more next week. I'm just going to ask you, the assignment is, there are 6 possible theses for your paper assignment. There's the pro and con, or this side and this side of each of these assignments. Literally just write out what those 6 possible theses are. And this is just to make you engage with the material, get used to what these questions are, how we would go about approaching it. The next week, which is our last class, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about turning outlines into papers. So you'll have an assignment due that is basically turn in a very, very rough outline of your final paper. And by rough outline, I literally mean it's going to be, if you have 6 paragraphs, say, for each paragraph, there's going to be like 2 sentences. So we're also going to be talking about signposts, which are sentences that start your paragraph to tell the reader exactly what you're going to do in that paragraph and how it fits into your paper. So next week, we'll be talking about how to write a paper in general, and I'll talk about theses and how to go about doing the thesis assignment. The next week, we'll be talking about the thesis assignment and then starting to talk about what makes a good thesis, a bad thesis a little more, and then leading into how do you go, once you have a thesis, how do you turn it into a paper? By December 8th, the last class, I'm going to want you to have decided what you're writing your paper on and have an outline to turn in class time so that the next day I can read them over, just give you some quick feedback and make sure you're on the right track. Then a week later, there'll be a 3 to 5 page paper due to follow along with the outline. If you hate all the prompts and want to write about something else, you're welcome to, but I tried to make them pretty scaffolded and streamlined. So like a lot of you, this will be your first time writing a philosophy paper, maybe your last time, but I think this is a useful skill to have of writing these sorts of critical thinking style essays, because these same sorts of argument structure and practicing arguments are something which are going to be useful outside of a philosophy context. So even if you never take a philosophy class again, I just think practicing this sort of skill, it's kind of like the culmination of everything we've done all semester. We've been talking about what critical thinking is. We've been talking about how to do it well, how to do it poorly, why we think wrong. Well, now we're going to have an opportunity. This is you constructing your own argument in written form. So that's what the rest of the semester is going to look like. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to shoot me an email. So for next week, it's just reading the prior guidelines for writing a philosophy paper. And then next week, I'll talk more about the thesis thing, and the week after's outline thing and the final paper. But that's it for this week. Have a great evening, and I will see you all next week. Stay about as sane as you can. Hopefully you're staying a bit saner than I am. I think my brain's falling out. So have a good one, everyone, and I will see you all next week.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care, Professor. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.